One of the most amazing things I've seen in the natural world was on the slopes of mountains in Austria. It was sunny and snowing at the same time, and somehow it didn't just create the standard arc rainbow, but created these rainbow waves that arced up and down. It was just amazing. What is our response to nature? Maybe phenomena like that, or something much simpler, maybe just admiring the plants and flowers in the garden, or enjoying the waves of the beach on holiday, maybe looking at the mountains around us in Cwmbran. Or if you're a real couch potato, what about just watching the nature documentaries on TV? How do you respond to nature? I think there are three main ways that people respond to nature, which mark out three different ways of understanding God. First is that nature is chaos. Now, this view sees it all as just random chance, chaos with no purpose, no meaning, no creator, and actually no God at all. God is gone. This is the view of the person who is an atheist, the person who doesn't believe that there is a God at all. This world just came into being by chance, takes care of itself, and has no greater reason for being. Nature may amaze, but it has no meaning. Second view of nature is that nature is abandoned. Now, this view would accept that there is a God, at least probably. This God may be the cause behind all nature. How exactly this God did that doesn't matter, but this God doesn't have any ongoing involvement in this world. God is distant. So nature may amaze, but it doesn't then speak of God in any active way. Third, that nature is God. This is a view of some of the Eastern religions, that nature is actually divine or contains the divine. Nature is God and God is nature. But it can easily be the perspective outside of those religions as well. It's to focus all of our admiration and hope on what we can experience in the natural world. Nature may amaze, but our amazement is merely directed at nature itself. Now, to counter those perspectives, this song, like the rest of the Bible, offers an alternative view. This song gives us a glimpse of God, a God who exists, a God who is intimately involved in nature, a God who is greater than nature. And this song tells us three key truths about God, three defining characteristics. And the last two of these are seen through nature itself. Nature, if you like, is like the telescope that we look through to see the God who is beyond. But they cannot be seen and understood from nature without the first characteristic in this psalm. The first one, we are to see God's grace. And that's in verses 1 to 4. Many of us will have seen the TV show Through the Keyhole. They actually revived it last decade with comedian Keith Lemon. Basically, Keith Lemon would film himself walking around a celebrity's house looking for clues as to who this celebrity was. And then the other celebrities in the studio, they would try and guess who that hidden celebrity was. Now, I'm not sure if it ever happened, but wouldn't it be a funny thing if they got to the end of the clues, even revealed who the celebrity was, and still nobody knew who they were? It would make the whole game show pointless if they didn't know the celebrity in the first place, wouldn't it? Well, looking around nature, trying to figure out what God is like, is a pointless exercise unless we first know who that God is. And we first come to know him in and through his grace. Now, grace is an act of kindness that we don't deserve. In fact, it's kindness when we deserve the very opposite. So in order to understand grace, we need to understand what we do deserve. And to understand that, we first need to understand sin. Now, sin is not merely the fact that we do things that are wrong. such as the fact that we tell lies to get ourselves out of trouble, or that we sometimes think badly of others even when they don't deserve that. We do things wrong, and they are sins. But sin is much more deep and profound than that. The greatest sin is to fail to love God with the love that he deserves. And as God, he deserves to be loved as our greatest love, with all of the love that we can offer. But which one of us can say that we have always loved God more than we've loved anything else? And which one of us can say that we always love him with every ounce of our being? All humans of all time have consistently chosen to love whatever we want, and to even cut God completely out of our lives, not giving him a second thought most of the time. And the result of that sin is that we deserve for God to wash his hands of us. We deserve for him to say, I want nothing more to do with human beings. That's what we deserve. However, grace steps in to what we deserve and gives us something good that we don't deserve. We don't deserve to be forgiven for having kept God out of our lives and not loving him with the love that he deserves. But God sent his son, Jesus, to die, taking our sinfulness upon himself so that we could be forgiven. It's not deserved forgiveness, but it's of God's grace, out of his loving kindness. So let's hear this song sing of his grace. Have a look, first of all, at verse 3. When we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave our transgressions. And transgressions there is another word for sins. Sin does that. Sin overwhelms us, like it speaks about there. When we're aware of how serious a thing sin is, it brings us a right sense of guilt. And when we realise that one sin leads to another, and exposes how serious a thing it is to turn our backs on the God of the universe, it can feel like all this sin is mounting up on us, and we're in sinking sand, going down, going under, soon to suffocate, overwhelmed with sin. And as overwhelmed as this songwriter David and his people were, God's forgiveness steps in and lifts him out of his sin. By being forgiven, his sin is no longer counted against him. Sin is no longer theirs to be found guilty of, or ours to bear when it has been forgiven by God. And what happens next is that David and his people, having been forgiven by God, they can now be brought near to God. There is access to God. There is acceptance in him when we've been forgiven. Before that, before we're forgiven, our sin is a barrier that we've put between us and God. But forgiveness breaks down that wall. Have a look at verse 4. Blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. So having been forgiven, David and his people are brought near to God, able to worship him in his temple, able to enjoy the good things that God provides them in that place of worship. Forgiveness brings us near to God, and it allows us to share with him, to share his good things that he wants to share with us. So have you come to know God's grace for yourself? Have you experienced his loving kindness in forgiving all of your sin and bringing you near to himself so that he can share his goodness with you? That is what it means to become a Christian, to experience grace. And without first experiencing that grace, we cannot know God, and we therefore cannot understand this world properly. Come to him today, receive his grace, and then you can have a right understanding of this world. But how does this psalm begin? In verse 1, it begins with praise. It begins with recognition of who this God is, that results in people telling him how wonderful he is, how worthy he is. Our praise kicks things off, but it's in response to the grace that he has shown in forgiving us and in bringing us to himself. Let's have a look at the second characteristic here. Secondly, we see God's power in verses 5 to 8. Now, before we see God's power, notice how this section leads with God's grace again in verse 5. God answers those who desperately rely upon him for forgiveness. He is the hope for all the people across the world. And in light of that, we see his power. And that just reinforces what we've just been considering, that we need to see his grace and to know him in order to see him through the telescope of nature. So then, in light of him being the God of grace who draws us near, how do we see his power in nature? Now, when you get a chance, spend a few minutes looking at the mountains. And when you're looking at them, have a think to yourself about how strong and mighty they are. Now, whenever there's a storm, our shed doors get blown in, folded by the wind. But when did the mountains last tumble over in a windstorm? I've often had to bump start a car, and that involves me pushing a car in order to try and get some speed. I can push a car, but I've never tried to push a mountain along. That would be absurd. Mountains are strong and powerful. And if that's so, then the one who made them must be even stronger, even more powerful than the mountains. And that's what verse 6 tells us, that God formed the mountains by his power and his strength. What about the waves? They're also very powerful, aren't they? We sometimes forget how dangerous they are, which is why we sometimes hear of tragedies at sea. You can play around with water in your bath and it just runs off you. If you rock yourself back and forth in the bath, then you can create waves even, and you'll probably make a mess of the floor in the process. But when we're talking about the waves of the sea, though it's the same substance, water, the scale is so much greater. Those waves that you see crashing on the shores of West Wales, they've been gradually forming and building for 3,500 miles. Every mile adds energy to those waves. And then the bigger waves will swallow up the smaller waves, and those big waves will become even bigger, and there's just no way of stopping them. But God can stop them. As verse 7 tells us, he stills the roaring seas. God can cause the waves to stop in an instant. And how we can see that in Jesus, the God-man who in a storm in a boat with his disciples, he simply speaks and the waves stop. Well, as a result of God's power as the one who creates the mountains and the seas, as a result of that, verse 8 tells us that the whole earth is filled with awe at what God does. But notice there the last line of verse 8. The result of all of this awe is joy. In the face of an almighty, all-powerful God, it would be very easy to crumble in fear and to quake in your boots. And sometimes that's actually an appropriate response. God is so powerful, he could crush us in an instant. And it's right, in some sense, to be fearful of that. Yet because for David and for the Christian, this comes from a position of grace. This comes from a position of having been brought near to God by his forgiveness, out of his love, it evokes joy. Because he has brought us near, the fearful things of God bring us delight and pleasure. He's an all-powerful God, but he's made us his friends. And so we're on the side of the all-powerful God. It'd be like making friends with the biggest, strongest person in school. No one will mess with you then, and that gives joy. How much more so with God? Finally, let's see God's generosity. And here we're looking at verses 9 to 13. As we get into this section that speaks about God's generosity, notice how God is proactively working to care for this world. 5 of these lines start off with, you do this, you do that. So it says, you care, you enrich, you drench, you soften, you crown. God is proactive in his care for the world. But notice how the words are of God not being stingy, but of being generous in that care. So the end of the lines in verse 11 speak of bounty and abundance. The first line of verse 12 finishes with the sense of overflowing. The movement that happens in these verses, it speaks of moving from the streams to the crops to the flocks, which makes sense, doesn't it? God provides the water then waters the crops in the fields, which then provides for the herds of animals as they eat from the fields, which then provides for us as we eat the animals, at least some of us anyway. Now, I'm quite careful with money. If we need something, I don't just buy the first thing I see. I look around online to make sure I'm getting the cheapest deal. Doesn't always pay off, because sometimes the cheapest deal is also the worst quality and you end up buying twice. But you need to be careful the less money that you have. And as a single income family, we have to make sure that we're being careful. But imagine that you had the wages of these footballers that some of us were watching just last week. Do you know the average carpenter makes around £28,500 every year, on average? Now, Harry Kane, he makes that every single day. Every single day he earns the yearly wage of your average workman. It's so much money, isn't it, that you don't have to worry about shopping around to try and get the cheapest deal. He's probably never used eBay. You can just throw your money at whatever. Well, God, as the God of the universe, he owns it all. There's nothing in this universe that doesn't rightfully belong to him, which means he can be incredibly generous. He pours it out in plenty on this world to give us all that we could need. But look right at the end of verse 13. What do we see? They shout for joy and sing. Once again, the result of God's character is for this world to shout for joy and sing. Now, if Harry Kane were walking down the street with wads of cash, giving it away to anyone, I'm sure he would be surrounded by happy, thankful people. If God is caring for this world all of the time in a generous and giving way as he is, he should even more so be surrounded by happy, thankful people. People who experience joy and sing. Now, 2 things to wrap up our thoughts. First of all, how does this compare to the 3 views that we began with? Well, with the chaos view that there is no God, this song insists that God is there and that it's not chaos. He has formed it and he has it all under control. With the abandoned view that God is distant, this song tells us that God is very much involved in nature. He brought it into being, but he cares for it. He provides all that is needed in this world. With the view that nature is itself God and our object of worship, well, this song provides a distinction between creator and created, between nature and God. And rather than us worshipping nature, it actually shows nature even worshipping God. We need to rightly think about God and nature by what the Bible tells us. And that will then result in joy and praise to God from us. Finally, though, I want you to see here a movement through the whole psalm. The song begins in church. This is a song for the gathered people of God to sing as David writes them and writes the song and leads the people in song. This is a song for those who have received his grace, being forgiven, being brought near to God. This song begins in church, but it very quickly moves into a song for the whole world to join in. Not just for the natural world, but for the people of the world to join in with this song. In verse 5, God is described as the hope or even the trust of all the ends of the earth. He is the hope of all people everywhere. And as verse 8 finishes, from the sunrise in the east to the western horizon where it sets, and everywhere in between, songs of joy are called for from all people across the world. This song of the God who made us, who cares for us, who offers to forgive us, this song begins in church, but it must move outwards to the world. It is our privilege to sing this song amongst our family, friends and neighbours. As they too look on nature and admire it, we can show them a very different vision of this world, pointing them to the God who made it all, who cares for it all, and who longs to bring us to himself by forgiving us in Jesus. Well, let's sing one more song before we come to a close.